I understand you all talk a lot about this, so I'm not going to go through the basics on entrepreneurship, but what I want to talk about today is really what a region has done that was once an area that was the top entrepreneurial center in the world, and certainly in the country, which now a lot of you think of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, Silicon Valley as the epicenter, which it is, for entrepreneurship. And so how did we get to that point, and what are we trying to do about it today is a little bit of the context for this morning's discussion and why this might be an important topic in everyone's future, not just if you're in high school, college, but if you're an adult. The average adult that we see starting a business is in their mid-40s, so generally don't wear a hoodie. Generally aren't starting online businesses, but entrepreneurship can relate to a lot of different technologies, a lot of different areas, as I'm sure you've heard about. To me, it's about doing something with scarce resources, whether it's people, dollars, research capacity, whatever that might be. It's getting by with less and trying to figure out how to make PowerPoint work when it doesn't work on the computer here, or having some help with that. But let me relate it to today's current economic situation, and certainly Northeast Ohio doesn't escape this. But when does 8% equal 12.3 million? Anybody draw the distinction between these two figures? Anybody want to take a guess at this? Yes. It is. And 12.3 million therefore would be 12.3 million people who are unemployed, out of work. And that is just the ones that are reported. This is not the ones that don't report, that have been out of work for 2 years, 3 years, beyond, aren't working. So how does it relate to that? If we go to the next slide, please. Well, how it relates is, and you probably heard, if you watch TV at all and saw a lot of the political advertisements, you saw that a lot of discussion around small business and its effect on the employment opportunities in the United States. Why is that? It's not because big companies that you see are less patriotic or less desirous of helping people gain employment. It really is more about the fact that big companies who typically have large shareholders or large numbers of shareholders who have part ownership in that company are trying to become more efficient. They're trying to say we have 5,000 employees and we want to double our revenues with the same 5,000 employees, and therefore we'll make a lot more profit. And if we make a lot more profit, our shareholders will be happy, our stock price will go up, we'll have done the right thing for our ownership. But in the case of an entrepreneur who might be 2 people or 3 people, they're racing to move that business ahead or they're going to die. So they're not content with going along and being at the same size because otherwise they might be going out of business. They're trying to get that business started, thriving, competitive, taking over the world potentially, and they're going from 1 to 2 to 4 to 5 to 10 people, which may not sound like a lot given that it's one company, but when you start to multiply that times thousands of startups, you suddenly have a lot of employment growth. And when you multiply it against tens of thousands across the US, this is where the job production comes from. And so as a result, if you don't have a thriving set and a thriving number of these startups in your local economy, you won't have great employment opportunities. So what economists and others have found throughout the years is that this is an important part of any economic system in a local economy or in the broader US economy. Now, if you're Silicon Valley or maybe New York or Boston, maybe you're not as affected by this because you have a very robust local startup economy, but even that can't carry beyond their borders. So you have to have this in a broader way. You have to have this across a broader geographic area. So if you take a look at, and I'm sure you've covered much of this, but if you take a look at all these companies that have grown up through the efforts of entrepreneurs, Howard Schultz is a great example because I worked in Seattle where he went about, think about the craziness of entrepreneurship when you think of some of these ideas. So at the time that he started Starbucks, you could get a cup of coffee for a dime. And so he goes out to investors and says, I want to sell coffee for $5. I said, are you crazy? Why would anybody pay $5 for something they get today for a dime? It's basically given away if you'll come in and eat a meal. And so he had a totally different approach to coffee, to making the best coffee, to charging a premium. It took a long time for that business to thrive. But again, imagine that idea to a banker who's used to drinking coffee at 10 cents. So these are disruptive things that happen that upset the apple cart, that upset the current actors that might be in a market space that suddenly, or not suddenly, but over time can become very large and powerful companies. You think of John D. Rockefeller, you think of Standard Oil. What was the big deal about Standard Oil being founded in Cleveland? Well, they turned crude oil into kerosene, which wasn't for automobile, wasn't gasoline, wasn't what you might think of in terms of the formation of an oil company. But kerosene was used then to heat houses and light homes versus whale oil. So what industry did it upset? The whale oil industry, right? But it went on to then power cars and everything, you know, become a very large business. And we can go through the list. You know about Mark Zuckerberg, Henry Ford, Steve Jobs. A lot have been written about these folks. Many of them disruptors, challenging the status quo, saying, you know, I see a different future. Might be seen as crazy, but I see a different future. If you knew Steve Jobs back when, you would have seen him as crazy and really a character, which he was certainly later in life, but proved his vision. If we can go on to the next. So what we do, and I'll go into that in a second in terms of what Jumpstart has done, because while we had a lot of great roots in entrepreneurship, we lost our way because what happened was we became victims of our success, we, Northeast Ohio. And by that I mean, because we had big companies formed, whether it was Standard Oil, which later became BP, whether it was Goodyear, Goodrich, you name the company, as they grew up, they brought in a lot of employment opportunities. They brought in people from other states. They needed so many workers. So the career path then was go to work for a big company, because those people that start companies, they're crazy, right? So you don't want to be seen as crazy. You want to go to work for a big company. That was what became part of our culture. And so what we lost, what happened was the area was thriving economically, but we lost that feeder system of startup companies, those next set of disruptors that could challenge the status quo. And I'll give you a small example of that. So if you go down into Akron, which is and was seen as the rubber capital of the world, you have a small company that started that whole revolution down there called B.F. Goodrich, started by Benjamin Franklin Goodrich, who was a surgeon in World War II, trained at Case Western, but later lived in New Jersey. But the city fathers of Akron convinced him to start a business in Akron to put air in a rubber tire. That was the first time air had been placed in a rubber tire. Generally, tires were hard rubber, very hard ride at that point, but there were no cars. This was for wagons, basically, and the early automobiles. And the automobile takes off. Of course, rubber tires are the preferred way of going. That starts an entire, what would today be known as a cluster, an industry segment, if you will. Lots of employment opportunities. Fast forward beyond the early 1900s into the mid-60s. Small French company comes along called Michelin, now a much larger company, and makes what they call a radial tire. Totally disruptive to the automobile industry. And literally tens of thousands of jobs are wiped out almost overnight in Akron, Ohio, because we lost that disruptive startup set of actors that are going to take the place of the next of the big companies. As big companies tend to go through cycles, both positive and negative, and those negative cycles, you need somebody else to take their place, or those employment opportunities go away. And those employment opportunities went away, not to one of our disruptors, but to one from France. So we lost that employment situation. So we're put in place to help with a number of areas, because what we found was, as we lost those small company startups, we lost the ecosystem to support them, which included capital, connections, where they could get advice, and where they could house themselves. And those are the four things that we pay attention to in helping companies is, can we give them a little bit of risk capital where a bank won't step in because it's a risky situation. So a little bit of risk capital to get them going, some advice to help them as first-time entrepreneurs, maybe some space. We don't provide the space, but can we connect them to space? But can we get them connected within their industry to help grow that company? So all these things that I talked earlier about, scarcity of resources, these are some of the scarce resources that entrepreneurs need as we try and develop that part of our ecosystem here locally that helps feed the next generation of companies and helps feed the employment opportunities that should exist in an area. So we help accelerate these success of companies as well as diverse entrepreneurs, because we are in Northeast Ohio in a minority-majority population. So if we do not provide opportunities for diverse entrepreneurs, we will miss huge opportunities to advance the economy. So that's the other piece that we pay attention to. And the reason we do this is because typically the venture capital business is a passive one. And when I say venture capital, I'm talking about people that will put money in, risk capital, not bankers, but people that will hand over money in exchange for equity, for an ownership stake in that small startup. And typically, women and minorities are underrepresented in that business, not because VCs are prejudiced in any way, but because they wait for people to come to them. right? And so the people coming to them are typically the Caucasian segment of the population, and we've got to change that if we're going to totally take advantage of the opportunities across all population segments. And so we do that through education and other means to help folks understand how to make those connections. So our role includes, as advisor, as an advocate. Those of you that went to the annual meeting, community meeting, I think the whole class went, or most folks in the class. Why do we do that? So we help the community understand what is this all about. So anybody, whether it's an investor, whether it's just a community member, whether it's a student, a teacher, can go to that and say, what's going on in Northeast Ohio with startups? What kind of companies do I see here? What kind of individuals? What kind of opportunities? How do I make those connections? That's a place to help that, because this is more than just an organization doing this. It's an ecosystem growing up, and people understanding what that's all about and trying to become part of it and trying to say this is an acceptable way. Yes, there might be some crazies in this room because that's maybe what it takes, a Steve Jobs or two, or that kind of mentality, but that's okay. That's acceptable. As we try and make this cultural shift back to entrepreneurial or an entrepreneurial direction being acceptable, right? How do we make that part of our culture so that this becomes part of the economic infrastructure that we build here, so that we have a more sustainable economy and one that can really survive both the challenges presented by the larger economy, but also the local challenges that we face each and every day. So one thing that I note there is that we make investments. So we're a nonprofit that makes investments in companies in exchange for equity. This was one of the first in the nation, probably the second or third in all of the United States. And I think it's credit to the local philanthropy and the local community coming together to say, how do we fix this? And how do we put our own money into it and put that money into companies? So it's very, very unusual that a nonprofit would be allowed to do such a thing. Now, anything that comes back, so if we invest in the next Facebook or whatever the case may be, if we profit from that, that goes back into the nonprofit, so that money can go back out to the next set of startups. So it's called an evergreen fund in that sense, and that's where the community is really bought in to say, if we're going to have the next set of John D. Rockefellers, we've got to provide that encouraging capital that allows them to start that business that's highly risky, and we'll put the money in there when the banks won't step in. So this is a set of folks that we work with, and you see the poster on the wall, but if they say it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a village to help entrepreneurs. Not one organization, not one person can handle this task. We work in a very large area of a very diverse set of entrepreneurs, diverse in many different ways, including the technologies that they're trying to get off the ground and turn into real companies. So it takes a number of folks, whether it's an incubator, whether it's an educator, whether it is venture capital, whether it is service providers, whether it is most important, and I talk about scarcity of resources, but if you take a look at all of the funds that are there on the list, of which that is only a partial list, at one point, not more than 6 or 7 years ago, there was one fund in Northeast Ohio that people could apply to, so you had literally hundreds of people wanting to start businesses and only one fund to provide that capital. Now there's a dozen. So the chances of a good idea getting funded are greater today than there's ever been before. So if we could go forward, we deal with, Jumpstart deals with Northeast Ohio, which is basically the GDP of Singapore. So nearly 12 million people, and a very, very large part of the United States, and certainly a large part of Ohio. And 6 of the 10 largest cities in Ohio are in Northeast Ohio. If you think about Cleveland, Akron, Youngstown, et cetera, they're here. Next one, please. So, as an advisor, providing this intense business assistance, mentoring, talent and hiring, one of the biggest limiting factors for any small company is where do I find that next key employee, and where do I find that next person who has to be a little crazy to want to jump into this startup and work for less than the normal wage that they might make in a bigger company. And then education. So how do we help folks learn and understand this? You're participating in an educational program to help understand this, but most of the folks that come to us have not taken courses because they've come to this later in life, but they've got an idea and they want to advance that business. So we have to do a lot of education to help them understand all the nuances of what it takes to succeed with a startup. So one of the things that we've done most recently is engage a lot of the folks that have been successful with startups as mentors. to give of their time on a very prescribed basis. And by that I mean, it's a program that was developed at MIT that we license. MIT's been doing this for about a dozen years. It was started by a friend of mine there. And this program engages community leadership, the best of the best. Literally, we have, as an example, the founder of OfficeMax, helping companies on a very dedicated basis to help them grow and to mentor the next set of entrepreneurs so that the Steve Jobs of the world, the Mark Zuckerbergs, not only have the responsibility to advance their company, but they have the responsibility to advance the next generation. So it's these folks that are stepping in to help on a dedicated mentorship basis. And right now we've got 24 startups involved in this program. We hope to make this many more dozens in the next year to 2 years. So, and one last point on that is that this is also an attempt to move this into an organic state, meaning eventually if we do our job well, and this group of folks do their jobs, many of these folks that are supported by, by foundations that are nonprofits, we want to make sure that if we do it right, we can go out of business over time. That you don't need this artificial assistance, if you will, being there to solve for some market failings. You know, you don't want the public sector stepping in always. You want them to step in times of emergency, in times of acute need, but you also want to fix things, right? You want this to become a normal part of our culture, an organic part of our culture, and maybe, so we get bigger over time and then we get smaller over time as this begins to take root. So a mentor program, getting those engaged in a local community to say it's your responsibility to bring the next generation along of entrepreneurs, whether they're mid-40s or teenagers or anywhere in between. That's your responsibility. As people accept that responsibility and do that on their own, there's less need for the public sector and the private sector to step in and do that for them. So this is a part of trying to get back to the culture, trying to get back to the future, if you will. So we talk about mentorship. The other thing that we've done is hire a number of board members and help hire folks from both inside the region and outside the region to join these startups, key talent that we place. And then the other thing we do is we talk about the scarcity of resources and trying to do more with less if you're an entrepreneur. One of the scarce resources folks have is marketing help. And so we help, if you take a look at the signage, this is all signage and logos and things that we've worked on to help companies as they go out and try and gain a toehold in the market. So the company in the upper right, Anderson Aerospace, makes a new kind of antenna for light aircraft so that they can get high-speed internet, TV, and other kinds of signals into a plane. And so they do that in a way that is lighter, which means fuel savings, and it gets better reception. And that company was started in Kent, Ohio. And so we helped them with that display. They went to the Paris Air Show, got a number of key contacts there, and are beginning to get traction in the aerospace market. So we talked about education and some of the things that we've been doing. We do this across a variety of ways. We do it with our own set of entrepreneurs, but we also do it with through programs such as in support of what John Clipfell is doing and others, so that at a collegiate level we can begin to, and even a high school level obviously, but at all levels we can get folks understanding this concept and whether they want to pursue this themselves or want to participate in some way in helping others, then that's a good thing as far as we're concerned. And then the other thing is I talked about, the resources that are there today, but we're also trying to add resources in other areas where there is a scarcity of resources that entrepreneurs can tap into, and whether that's a better way of networking throughout all these various organizations, a better way of making those connections. We try to make that an easier process for entrepreneurs. Talked about the network of partners. One thing to note here is in the next 60 days, we'll be doubling the number of collaborators that you see there. The poster is now outdated. But the state of Ohio has something that's very unique called the Ohio Third Frontier Program, where bonds have been issued and borrowed against and are funding partially organizations like our own and others across the state and young companies. And the way this capital, the theory behind this capital is unique in the United States, here in Ohio. This is a $2.3 billion bond issue that is borrowed against to fund this kind of work and this kind of activity for innovation and entrepreneurship, broadly speaking. And that's important because how do you pay back that bond? Well, if we're right about this employment being connected to startups, if we support startups and drive greater employment, what happens is as those people get employed, they pay tax. That tax then funds the service of that debt. So the more taxes coming in, the more you're able to pay down that debt. So Ohio, through its voters and its legislators, is making a big bet, a multi-billion-dollar bet, that if we bet on these entrepreneurs and these young companies, and we help that through organizations, through seed capital, through a variety of means, the economy will get better, the employment opportunities will get better. And so far, the statistics are proving that to be true. Now, this is a long-term proposition. This isn't a 1 or 2 or even 1 term of a governor. This is long-term, but so far, knock on wood, so far so good. Next one, please. A bunch of the resources, that's okay. There's a ton of resources everywhere from just space to hang out in, to funds, to wet labs, whatever you need is whether you're a bioscience entrepreneur, an IT entrepreneur, there's a lot of resources available. Healthcare is a big one now, but a number of different resources available. And then, again, this notion of putting money directly into companies, which I talked about earlier, is something that's critical. So we've put that in perspective, and this is a gentleman who came out of Akron, ADAP Nanotech, Sunny Sethi. He's an example of a company we've invested in. We've now invested $26 million in 67 companies. $26 million, money coming from the Third Frontier program and philanthropy in Northeast Ohio, gone directly into these companies. The companies that have given us that money to invest do not expect money back. That's all to continue to go into companies. So this is very unique in both Ohio and the nation that this activity should occur. And this is an example of a company where our latest investment, they're in Alliance, Ohio, and this father and son have an online learning platform, e-learning platform, so an internet play for the educational space. Big River, which is an ability to add a component to online giving so that you can drive greater donations to nonprofits through their websites, again, a local company. And so turning to the bet that I talked about earlier, will these bets pay off? And just a quick set of results, and then we'll wrap up. We're closing in on 3,000 jobs created through these investments. So there's support for these companies that we've provided. John Grimm is the president of Notice in Akron. They've just hired their 100th employee. It's a company we invested in its early days. So a very successful story here locally. Revenue generated, we're now approaching 100 million in revenue that these companies collectively generate. A lot of money coming in. And when you talk about economic development, that money is typically coming from outside of Ohio, coming into those companies, helping to hire local folks. That's a good thing. And then economic benefit, we track this across what are the indirect and direct benefits, over $250 million now in economic benefits locally, something we track very closely on a year-by-year basis. And then the other thing that's happening is, you actually can consider Ohio a place now where business is going to be started, and it's getting national press recognition for saying Ohio's got something going on, Northeast Ohio's got something going on, and that helps retain the population that has been flowing out of some of the major cities in Ohio and parts of Ohio, and bringing people back to say this is a vibrant place, because you don't have to leave to go to Silicon Valley. If you want to work in a startup, you can actually stay right here locally. And I am making that pitch directly to you because we'd love you to stay here locally and work in a startup. What could it mean for you? I guess putting it down into what I think it could mean anyway. Go ahead. One, there's a lot of challenges. If you think of college and getting a job, why do you go to college? Well, I have better education, better job, better opportunity. That's all true. But those are tough opportunities even today with the economy improving a little bit. Yet 50% of graduating seniors say they'd like to start a company someday. So there's this desire, this increasing desire for graduating seniors wanting to start companies. And we believe that trend will continue because it allows you to take control of your destiny. You don't have to, thinking about a job versus thinking about doing your own thing. That's what I think appeals to people. This is an example of a local company that started out of Case Western, Citizen Groove. Again, that has been recognized nationally as being one of America's best young entrepreneurs, and John Knifick, pictured there on the right. And for those that may not think high tech is the only way to go, here we have the owner of Melt, Who could have thought that, you know, a grilled cheese restaurant would take off as much as grilled cheese, really? Would that work? Well, guess what? It's working. He's opened quite a chain of restaurants now and very successful.
You can't get in them.
You can't get in them. They are packed. So one of the last points I want to leave you with is when we think of today's heroes, and this has been popular for a long time, we think of sports heroes. But when you think of sports heroes and you think of those that are making the big bucks, they're at the top of the pyramid. If you think of what separates the Tiger Woods from the person not making the cut in pro golf, it's a handful of strokes, right? It's not much that separates those two, but what separates their income is huge. So the person that didn't make the cut, only missed it by, you know, a few shots, is making very, very little money. Whereas the people at the top are making, the wealth is concentrated very much at the top. Whereas in entrepreneurship, you can find somebody. I just drove by Vertical Runner this morning at the corner of 82 and whatever that intersection is. Started in Hudson, Ohio. He now has 4 stores. This is an entrepreneur who is doing very, very well, who's a passionate runner turned entrepreneur. He's doing well. So it doesn't have to be the hoodie. It doesn't have to be Facebook. It can be the local baker in Hudson where I live. It can be Vertical Runner. It can be, there's many examples of this. Doing just fine, thank you very much. You don't have to be Mark Zuckerberg to succeed at this. You can own the local bakery, the local running store. It can be anywhere in between and many variations of that. So I think this is, you know, a message I want to leave folks with is this is an important area. It's an important area to consider in careers and career choices, and I think it has a lot of attractive elements. And I think we're wrapping up. Maybe you'll work for a startup, maybe you won't start one. Pet insurance, who'd have thunk it, right? You can insure your pets here locally. It's a startup, Laura Bennett, very successful entrepreneur who's raised a lot of money, very dynamic lady, and so, you know, we fund all sorts of ideas. That wraps it up. So that's the message. There's great opportunity. There's great reason for it. It's an important part of economic infrastructure. Ohio's unique with the Third Frontier program. Ohio's unique in organizations like Jumpstart that help out and try and generate activity in this area. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me or ask them now. But thanks for your time this morning. I really appreciate your attention to this subject matter. Thank you.